how to use live filter layers in Affinity Photo, in particular with shapes. I'm just going to create a shape now. Just going to create a quick circle, and I'm going to use this for a fair chunk of this tutorial, this circle. And of course you could make a much more complex design, but I'm going to go to Layer and New Live Filter Layer, and I'm going to go with Gaussian Blur. That's the first one. Now, not all of the blurs are available in the live filter layers. And what use of live filter layers? Well, the thing is with live filter layers is you can change the blending mode. You've got access to the blending mode. You can't do that in a filter menu. And you can run through them and you can create some very interesting designs simply by changing like the difference or lighten, etc. As well as change the opacity as well. And you can push beyond the limits by using the interactive setting. You don't have to use a slider. You can completely ignore the slider. You can also enter a value. Now, I'm not certain if there's a limit. It might be like 1,000 or something. I'm certain there is a limit. And if you push it too far, it might just refuse it. And of course, another thing with live filter layers is you can apply them more than once, multiple times. So you can also move them around. You can delete them. They're editable at any point. And they can be applied to a particular shape or all of the shapes and designs beneath that. Now I'm just going to go with another one, box blur. You can change the radius, and this creates a more square-like blurring effect, which you can see at times with that shape. Not always. At this point, it doesn't look like much. You can actually virtually make the entire screen red, make it blurred out by pushing it up to the limit. You also change, of course, the blending mode exactly the same, so you can see the underlying shape. And the blend mode is for the shape. You can see that design there. It creates a nice sort of, like as if a sun is sort of shining through the clouds in some weird way. And of course, what you can do with live filter layers, you can always add them again multiple times. So you got that effect. And you can go and add it again. Go down to box blur, or of course, you could go with Gaussian blur or any of the others. But you can say like 5 or 6 times, apply them 5 or 6 times on top of each other and use different blending modes. And of course, the underlying shape can still be edited. So if you decide, you know what, I don't want that circle, I can change the circle and the blur and everything is still there. And you can see by adding 2 and also combined with the blending mode of difference in this case, you can see the squareness of the design of that blur. But you can run through these different things and experiment, and there's a good 20 or 30 of them, 26 maybe, whatever. There's a lot. And every time you change blend mode, and you'll notice when you change them, in the history panel, an entry appears. So you might find that you, even though you've added a layer, you think that's one action. Well, all the various changes will be added in to the history panel. Now blur, and I'm not going to do box blur again, I'm going to do medium. And some do very little, I have to say. Some are very subtle. And you can see a subtle change then. It does slightly change the shape of that design. And of course, if you had a slightly different shape, if you had filled it with a gradient, etc., maybe with particles, different sort of design, the effect would be more pronounced. But I'm just showing it with this shape. Of course, there's thousands of shapes. You can make your own shapes. You can distort the shapes and so on and so on. Now, so medium is a more sort of averaging sort of blur. Bilateral blur. And you can change the radius. And you can change the tolerance. And you can, when you get it to a certain point, you'll notice the effect kicks in. That's the thing about a tolerance. We'll kick it in at that point. And you can see it now, you can see around the edge, there's a sort of blurring, a sort of dullness to it. but in the center, it's untouched. It's pity there's no invert feature where you can have it going the other way. Maybe we can't do that. Anyway, you can change the blend modes. And I'm obviously going with difference, and you can see that glow around the edge now. It's quite useful for creating a sort of like a blurry glow around the edge. And of course, you can apply it multiple times. You can edit the values multiple times as well via the layer panel. Just double click on the entry for the bilateral effect and you can change it. You'll notice occasionally I go to the filters. I do that by accident. I'm always just used to using filters instead of the layers. New live filter layer. And this time I'm going to go for motion blur. Now, by default, it's weird. It always defaults. You think it would remember the last time you used it, but it doesn't. Also, there's no presets. You can change the radius. You can also, of course, use blending modes. You can run through the blending modes. You can go for color dodge, difference, etc. And you can change the rotation. And you can interactively change it as well. So you can see that difference. Difference makes it even more pronounced, like an eclipse. And then you can, of course, interactively drag out. And you can change the rotation as well. Now it's a layer. So what you can do, you can duplicate that layer, or you can just add another layer. So layer menu, and you obviously add blur, and then of course you could use radial blur as well. Combine two blurs, but this one I'm combining motion blur. So it's two motion blurs, and then of course I can move them independently, and I can always go back to the previous motion blur and change that. And also I can change blending modes independently. So you could experiment. You can create some very weird, unusual, different designs like that one. And different. Just move that backwards and forwards. And you can then change the rotation, keep doing that. And you can run through, and of course, I've just done 2. It doesn't have to be just 2. It can be 3 or 4 or 10. Though it'll probably get slower. I would have to say the effect may just be not great. But experiment if you wish. And of course, the underlying shape is still, that's always lovely, the contrast negate. The underlying shape is still there. So you can still go and edit the shape. So if you've got a totally different shape, maybe a star design or a more complex vector design, the end result there will be even more spectacular and unusual. So layer menu, and again go to new live filter layer, blur, and this time radial blur. Now this one's always quite a good one. You can change the angle. You can see it becomes more like an arc as it just goes around there, and you can also interactively modify the angle. You can also change the origin point, so you can move backwards and forwards. So you can create some very interesting designs simply. And again, as I say, this is a circle. You could have like a star or any other more complex vector design, maybe multiple vector shapes underneath this effect. And you will then be able to create more unusual designs. And again, you've got the blending modes to go through as well. So difference or darken, etc. And of course, you can add them again and again. So once you've got that design, of course, what you can also do with these designs, you can merge them together. So there's a merge visible command. So you can merge them into one. And then, of course, you can take that layer and manipulate it with other designs, maybe deform or something. So there's blur, and now go down to lens blur. Change the radius, make certain it's actually got something blurred, otherwise you will not see much. You can also change the number of blades. I have to say the blades feature probably works best with different designs. Doesn't really work so well with shapes. It's very subtle if you change the number of blades. But you can also change the threshold, factor and colour, and also of course combine it with blending modes. So you can create some very interesting designs using that. So you've got lighten, overlay and so on. Some of these blurs seem to make hardly any difference with the shape. But you've got a design like that with screen, so you can actually see the underlying shape. And of course what you can do, like I say, you can modify the threshold, modify the colour, etc. Many of these things I've shown in an earlier video with the filters, so I'm not going to go through every single setting. Then you've got depth of field. That's another one that's really quite good. It's actually got more interactive features than some. Now you can change the origin point, you can move, and of course, without changing the radius, you can't see any difference at all. So just increase the radius, at least so you can see it. Now you've got the sharpness and center. You've got the graduated blur to the edge, from one edge to the other edge, and then beyond that, the blur is still the same all along. And you can change the opacity, change blending modes. You can change the vibrance and clarity as well. And of course, not so particularly effective with the solid color. You can, of course, turn it into ellipse, squeeze it. You've also got an option at the top, it says elliptical. You can turn it also into a tilt. It works similar sort of things. And again, I've gone through that in an earlier video. But you can move it around. You can see you get that sharpness at a particular place. And the same with the tilt. If you move it around, you've got those lines that you can have that defined area of sharpness. And then you've got the graduated blur. And then beyond that, the blur itself. Rest of the blur. And again, what you can do, you can, of course, add multiple filter effects to that, live filter layers to that as well. So you've got layer. Now I'm going to go to blur and down to field blur. So again, this one's more like a Gaussian blur when it comes to a shape, to be honest. You can see very subtle changes with the selected handle level. Just change that slightly. You can just see a slight trailing off. But the change of the radius, it's more blur, Gaussian blur-like. You've also got this origin point or some other thing. To be honest, I have no idea what that does. Certainly in connection with the shape. I admit it. Moving around, it has no effect whatsoever with the shape. Certainly it's very effective with images. Maybe I should go back to the help file and have a look, just check out what it does. But it doesn't seem to do much with shapes. Go to blur and then go down to diffuse. Now this one does nothing with shapes. Or very little. Again, it's one of those ones, subtle. So obviously I'm using with shapes. If you're using them with images, the result will be very different. But this video is about shapes, using the run through of all of the blurs with shapes. And some of them have very little impact. It's just not how they work. So blur and go down to maximum blur. And that's probably why they stuck them at the bottom, to be honest, with these. Because this one, all it does is turn it into a rectangle or rounded rectangle or a circular effect, depending. But you've still got the blending modes. So you can change the blending modes. Some, obviously, if you go with darken, no use. But if you go through them, you can see you end up with that black center if you use like difference. And you can, of course, interactively modify it. So you get that nice there, or you can extend it to fill the entire screen with your image, with that shape, that color. Must do a video where I've got maybe a gradient or something. instead of just a standard solid colour. And then there's the last one. I'm just going to go for the last one. This one just basically does the opposite. Instead of growing, it's minimum, it shrinks it. So you can see you just shrink it and you end up with this sort of rounded diamond design. And again, you can go for the blending mode, though in this case, makes no difference whatsoever. You can run through them. Oh, it's subtle, very subtle changes to the colour, but you can't see the underlying shape, etc. Though you can see the underlying colour, obviously, it has some effect. And then you can, of course, change interactively the blur there as well, and circular, and do the same with the slider. So that's running through with a very basic shape. But of course, you can use it with more complex designs than that. This time I'm going to go with the star. And of course, you can vary the star. You can change the number of points. But I'm going to go with this one at this point. You can change the colour. And you can duplicate the design, maybe, so you don't have to just have one shape. So you can create a couple of shapes and then apply the effects to those. Go and change the colour of that. Obviously not going to be much good if I had both having red. So maybe go for a blue or an orange or green, whatever. You got that star design. What you can then do, of course, it's going to quickly go down there, layers. Just quickly show you the layers. That's via the view menu and studio in layers. So you can see the two layers there. You can group them, of course. Or you can just, in this case, deselect both of them. So none of them are selected. So now the live filter layer will be added above the existing shapes. So again, go to new live filter layer, and I'm not going to run through them all. That will be silly. So I'm just going to go through a couple of them. So radial blur or Gaussian blur, just choose one. But you can, of course, use the blur with a number of them. And again, change the angle and change the blending mode. And you can see by changing the angle there, and also by changing the origin point of the effect, is you can create some very abstract designs. Now, you could see that if you filled that screen with maybe multiple different shapes and different colours, you could create some very, very unusual abstract designs very quickly just by using that blur effect. And again, you've still got the blend modes to go through. So you can go with darken, multiply, lighten, overlay, difference, and so on and so on. You can see a variety of different results. And you can change your opacity as well if you wish. And you can, of course, go for the full on all the way around. Set it 180, and you can see your star has become now a nice circle. And you can still move the origin point. So you can just move it around. So you can create a nice ring design. Of course, you can merge that layer, merge that design, then maybe combine multiple layers. So duplicate it, and then you can build up different combinations of those. Or maybe combine that design with those shapes, but move it down as a group. And then use the effects combined with light. And you can do whole loads of combinations. To go through it, there's numerous combinations of these things you can do. So you can make multiple layers of this. So I've got now 2 layers. I've duplicated the thing, and now you can see I can then move and change the origin point of the entire thing, the original effect as well as the shapes. And the underlying shapes are still editable. So you can still tweak those, and you can still tweak the angle itself. Until, of course, once you rasterize the whole thing or use the merge to make it, again, pixels. And you can see you can run through the blending modes there to create some interesting designs simply by, and you can of course move the origin point still with the blending mode active. You can see the design center there. And of course, what you can also do, you can add additional live filter layers. You don't have to, and then you can maybe add deform or some other effect, maybe the mirror effect. Unfortunately, they're not live filter layers, but it would be nice if you could. But again, but it will be rasterized. The result will be rasterized. I had to stop and think for a sec. There is no deform. Wish there was. It would be nice. Now I'm going to go with an arrow tool. So I've got a different design there. Now it's obviously on top of those filter layers, but I can move it down. So I've removed the original star. Now I can simply just drag that arrow down just below that radial blur. And of course I can still modify the underlying shape. And as you change that, of course the live filter effects, both the combination of, is changing. And of course you can change the color of the shape. So you can see, and also I've just got one shape, but I could have 3 or 4 shapes, 10 shapes. Could have stars with maybe different points. There's a whole number of combinations that you can use. And of course you could have shapes that have been modified by, I say, filter effects, of course, rasterizing them in its process. Well, there's the arrow. Again, layer menu and go to new live filter layer, blur, and then maybe Gaussian blur, motion blur, depth of field. Whole range of different blurs are available and they can all be added in combination. So again, you can change the radius, you can stretch it out to the arrow, and also of course you can modify interactively the rotation as well. So you can just make it, and it's a layer, again a layer, so you can apply that, close that one, and then add additional one, duplicate it, change the blending modes. You can run through the blending modes, just go make it difference or darken or multiply or lighten, just experiment. And you can see by just simply changing that, you can get all kinds of different effects, and the underlying design is still available to be edited. So you can still modify the arrow. Maybe use convert it into curves, and then use the node tool to modify the points. And then it's above. So you've got that design above. Now anything layers that I add below it now will be affected by that blur, that motion blur. So I can duplicate that motion blur. So I've got 2 motion blurs now applied, just obviously because there's only an arrow there. But I can also obviously change the rotation. So it doesn't have to be the same as before. So again, you can see, move it around. And you can, of course, change the blending mode for that. Change the rotation setting. So maybe go for difference or lighten. So you can see all different designs. And again, like I say, you can go down to the arrow and you can still interactively modify the arrow. So you can just turn it into different designs simply by dragging those interactive points. But also, like I say, you can convert it into just standard points or nodes. So layer menu and convert to curves. So now you can't modify the properties. But what you can do is you can go to the node tool and you can modify those individual nodes. And the effects are still above. Those layers are still above. And as you change them, of course, though the filter, the blur in effect is not changing. The settings, the actual result obviously changes. You can get some lovely shadowy effects there. You can see the arrow just going off in that different direction. And you can see the arrow there. So you can create some weird blur effects using this approach, using motion blur and combining. And of course, obviously I've only got 2 there, but I could use 3, 4, 5. And again, this time I've duplicated the arrow. So what I've got 2 elements now, and you can move those around. Again, they will both be affected by the live filter layer, and you can shift them around, and how they interact will change the blurring, and you change the color as well. So maybe go for an orange or mustard color and move that around. As you move it around, you see the red burst through. maybe move it the other way, and you'll get more different colour. So lots of different designs can be created from these shapes. And of course, I've been using motion blur, I could be using radial blur, or many of the others. So maybe just add another one. Maybe maximum blur, Gaussian blur. I'm going to go with a different shape. This time, I'm just going to create another one. What I'm going to do, I'm going to create a ring or a donut shape. Not certain. Is it ring shape, donut shape? Well, anyway, one of them. I always call it a donut. It says donut in the. You can see the entry in the layers as donut. Though, because I'm English, it's not spelled the same way. Anyway, you can duplicate holding down the Alt or Option key. And you can, of course, what you can do, you can change colours. And you can change the colour of that one. And you could, of course, if you wanted to, change the colours of all of them. I'm not going to go and do that because I'm just going to show you the effect. Now, deselect, so there's nothing selected. Otherwise, if you apply the live filter layer, the result sometimes will be attached to the thing, or it might put it at the top. It might put it somewhere where you don't want it to be added. So it's always best to deselect everything. You will then get the live filter layer applied at the top. And you can, of course, use any of them. Lens blur, radial blur. Actually, it's probably quite nice with the radial blur, to be honest. But anyway, I've gone with the lens blur. I could quite easily change my mind to apply different effects. And you can, of course, modify the threshold. Now, in this case, you will see the colour, the bloom really does kick in when you've got other colours. You can see the result. You suddenly lose the colour. You can change the bloom colour, bring more colour in. Or you go the other way. And you get that white. And of course, you can combine this, maybe apply it 2 or 3 times again. So it's just a live filter layer that can be added multiple times. So you can change the threshold, you can change the radius, you can change the number of blades again, all those sort of things, as well as the blend modes. And you can run through those. So sometimes you can see it works better when you've got multiple shapes than just a single shape. And then just apply that. And of course, you can duplicate that design, maybe go and add additional thing, or maybe layer menu and merge them all into a single layer. Now again, I've got none of them selected. So again, I can go to layer and new live filter layer, blur. So I'm going to go for, go down to depth field. Change that, change the radius so you can actually see some effects. So you've got the blur. Now what happens, you can see the blur, the sharpness in the center. You've got the graduated blur as it goes out, how it's affected all those designs. You can also, the vibrance kicks in a bit. You can actually see the colors change and clarity as well. I have to say it's very subtle. Yeah, you can see it change. When you go for clarity, that gives a sharpness to it. So you can just see a slight sharpness there. Some of these sliders are probably more useful for images than for things. And again, you can also, again, once you've done that, you can reduce down the clarity. You can see the sharpness again, but you of course still got the blend modes. You can go through those, run through those, and you can apply. And also there's a tilt option as well, the mode and tilt. So I'm using elliptical in this, but you can see the blending modes. So you can just create different blending modes. You can run through those and you can create some very interesting designs by simply changing those. Of course, you can apply the live depth of field again and again. So maybe create 3 or 4 different layers. You can continue to modify the origin point as well as the inner and outer radius. And also you can, of course, because it's an elliptical, you can also make it elliptical by going to the outer part and moving that in. And you can create some very interesting blurs. That very sharp bit in the centre, all the rest being blurred out completely. And that's using the overlay. But you, of course, can change blending modes. You can use normal or difference or whatever. So that's covered filters as well as live filter layers using shapes. But of course, you can use those with many others like gradients as well as images. And I might do a tutorial about gradients. I love gradients and I love blurring effects. Using the tilt option now. And you can see similar sort of thing, the sharpness in the center, the graduated blur, and then the blur, the constant blur outside of the region. Some of these live filter layers work really well with shapes. Not all, I must admit. Some have very little effect, but you can create some amazing designs. And sometimes they work better with maybe multiple shapes than just a single shape, and maybe work better sometimes with a more complex shape than just a circle. Well, you can do, like I say, layer, and you can duplicate. So now I've got two of that effect. So you can really, and of course you can always go click back into it, double click into that, and then re-edit if you want to change it. So you decide, I don't want the position to be exactly the same position. You can reposition it, you can angle, you can also change, obviously, the distances between the inner and outer point as well. So all kinds of blurs can be created with this. And the underlying shapes are still editable. That's the key thing in all of this. So you can always go and add some more donuts, unless you've eaten them. But you can change it in all kinds of ways. You can change the points using the node tool, etc. You can also change properties and so on and so on. And change the blending modes. And it's all live, all editable at any point until, of course, you use the merge command via the layer menu. And then once that's done, it's turned into a pixel layer and you can't change them. Hope you found this of interest. Please subscribe to the Graphicxtras channel, always adding new tutorials about Photoshop, Affinity Photo, Illustrator, and many others. Also, please add some comments, always appreciated. A dislike or like. Thank you much.